In the last section, we added all the HTML needed for this account menu, but it doesn't work yet. If I click on it, nothing happens. In this section, we're going to use JavaScript to get that menu to work. Let's take a look at a file called manifest.js and then also at our application layout right here. Now, the way Rails handles JavaScript has changed quite a bit over the years, but the latest iteration is probably the best. It uses something called import map. So we need to install import map and then a couple of Rails-specific JavaScript libraries, which are part of the Hotwire framework. Now, ordinarily, these are installed automatically as part of Rails new, so you might already have these depending on how you created the sample application. But the current version of the tutorial standardizes on skipping the first bundle step. That's for compatibility with various versions of Bundler. The way that Rails works is that it uses the most recent version of Bundler on the system by default, but that might not agree with the version of Bundler used in this tutorial. So that's why we skipped it before, but that means now we need to install these libraries by hand. So let's go here. It's Rails import map install with a colon, and then turbo and stimulus. We will be using turbo in this tutorial. We will not be using stimulus directly, but it's a good idea to include it just for completeness. Now, you may even have noticed that this line appeared. So this includes the necessary JavaScript libraries into our application layout. And here, these two lines have been added automatically as well. Now we'll start with an overview of how we're going to approach this problem, and then we'll get into the details. Step 1 will be to define behavior for a CSS class called active, which will apply to the menu to make it visible. It will be added right here. Step 2 will be to create a new custom JavaScript directory and a file called menu.js to contain the JavaScript that will dynamically add the active class right here. Step 3 will be to edit menu.js and actually add that code. Step 4 will use import map to tell Rails about the custom JavaScript directory. And step 5 will be to import menu.js into the JavaScript for our application called application.js. All right, let's look at the first step, which involves adding some CSS. Let's go to the bottom here and add some CSS for the drop-down menu. If we look over here, we've got a class drop-down menu. If we have that class and the class active, we're going to change the display to block. And as we'll see, that will actually cause the menu to expand. So drop-down menus for the drop-down menu class and then .active. So if it has both of these classes, we'll apply the rule display block. Now this class doesn't appear anywhere yet, so let's create the JavaScript that will dynamically add it right here. That brings us to our second step, which is to create a directory and file for the JavaScript. Call it custom, and then let's touch the file. We'll call it main.js. This brings us to step 3, which is the hardest of the steps, especially if you haven't got a lot of experience with JavaScript, maybe not any experience. So I'll walk you through it. We're not going to go into too much detail here because this is not a JavaScript tutorial, but if you're interested in learning more about these techniques, you can take a look at Learn Enough JavaScript to be Dangerous. This is the comment character in JavaScript, 2 slashes. We'll say, what are we going to do here? Add toggle listeners. Now, the way we're going to approach this is we're going to attach what's known as a listener to a particular element on the page. In this case, this one right here, the one corresponding to the ID drop-down menu. Notice this has both an ID and a class with the same name. So the basic strategy is to find that element on the page and attach a piece of JavaScript that will listen for a click. And when that click happens, it will add this active class that we just defined. Now, in order to attach the listener to the element in the header, we actually have to wait for the entire document to be defined. So we can do that by adding a listener to the document itself. Now, the default event corresponding to loading the document is called DOM content loaded. That's the document object model content loaded. This is a little weird. We give it a function with no arguments, and then we define our code. Now, this won't actually work here, though, because of Turbo. You saw that we added the Turbo library recently, and we'll be using that later in the tutorial. But that changes how the DOM gets loaded, so we have to change this here to turbo::load. And JavaScript lines end with semicolons, so let's add this in here. All right, now what we're going to do is define a variable called account corresponding to this account tab right here. That's this. So that's this here. So we're going to add a listener to that menu item. Now there are several ways to define variables in JavaScript. For the latest version of JavaScript, what we want to do is use what's called the let keyword. So we're going to let the account equal this. In Ruby, we wouldn't have to add an extra word here. We just say account equals. But here we say let account equals. Document is an object that represents the whole document. And now we're going to use a really powerful JavaScript method called query selector. And we'll give it, in this case, the CSS ID corresponding to the elements. See that here? ID equals account right here. So now let's add a listener. Same thing as here, add event listener. And it's going to wait for a click event. We give it a function, which takes an argument, which is the event itself. This is just a JavaScript object. Again, it's not important to know all the details here. Put in the semicolon. And now there are a couple of details that are really hard to guess. This just takes lots of experience, lots of Googling. In this case, I asked LearnNative co-founder Lee Donahoe for some help as well. So one thing we want to do is prevent the default behavior, which is ordinarily to click through the link. But we don't want to click through the link. That would lead to this URL right here, this stubbed out URL right here, this little hash symbol. But we don't want to do that, so we're going to prevent the default. And we're also going to prevent it from propagating deeper into the document. The truth is I barely know what this does, but what I do know is that if you don't put this in, it doesn't work. Probably. Actually, we can test that at the end. All right, now let's pull out the menu itself. You can see here, we mentioned before that there's an ID drop-down menu. So let's let the menu equal, again, query selector. And now the ID is drop-down menu. And now we're going to use some really nice JavaScript. We're going to look at the class list for this menu item, and we're going to toggle the active class. So what that means is that if there is no active class, it will add it, and if it is present, it will remove it. And so that will let us activate and deactivate the menu by clicking subsequent times. So this is the class that we just created right here, or whose behavior we created. So right now we're adding it and removing it corresponding to clicks. Okay, I'm going to save that. We'll see in a moment whether it works or not. But first we need to do step 4, which is to tell Rails about this custom JavaScript directory. It's right here. There's a file called import map in the config directory. You can see here. Right here. Now this is a great example of technical sophistication. Even if you didn't know how to do it, you can say, I can just copy from here. Instead of app JavaScript controllers, we can do app JavaScript custom. I like to line these up. By the way, this is also a great example of technical sophistication. Being able to generally follow along in a language you haven't necessarily studied is a really good skill to cultivate. Okay, our final step, step 5, is to look at application.js. And import custom/menu. And now these configuration changes are exactly the kind of thing that generally would require us to restart the Rails server. So let's look over here. First of all, we have to refresh. With JavaScript changes, you always have to refresh. But I think it's still not going to work. Right. So I'm clicking here, nothing's happening. So let's go and restart the server. Oh, still not working. This is a good chance to debug. Let's inspect it and look over here. It says unable to resolve specifier custom menu. Oh, and maybe you noticed this. I did not. I used the wrong name. I called it main.js. So let's undo that. All right, let's see if that worked. Okay, we may have to restart the server again. Aha! And now it worked. So you see, absolutely everything has to go right, even one little thing. In this case, it's a pretty big thing. It's just the wrong file name. But there are all kinds of things that can go wrong here. So do not be surprised if it doesn't work. If you can't get it to work, I suggest retracing your steps and make sure you're following every step in the tutorial exactly as written. You can see, even I didn't do that. It's so easy to make a little mistake like that. But the result is this beautiful menu. If you click it twice, it goes away, once, and again. And so I said we were going to do one more thing. Let's go to app, JavaScript custom, find our file right there. And I'm not sure about this. I'm going to comment this out with command/. Let's see if this works. Now, this is just a change to the JavaScript. I should not have to restart the server, although I might do it just for completeness. Okay, does this still work? It still does work, it seems. Okay, it looks like that does work. We might not need that line. Get rid of that here. Actually, you know what? Let me take a look at that. I think it might just be to keep the URL clean. So right now, you can see it ends with /. If I click this, no, that works. I think it's good. I don't think we need that extra line. All right, I'm going to remove that line. If things stop working mysteriously, you might want to add it back in. Also check the text, because if it turns out that is necessary, I will put it back in the text. but I think it'll work without. Actually, let's triple check that that's actually being executed. This is a nice trick for JavaScript. Yeah. So I added in an alert. So it says, hello. I just wanted to confirm that, in fact, the change had gone through. Okay. So this is the final code. Now we've got a working menu. Oh, we should refresh here. And there we go.